Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Jeff Elton, CEO of Concerto HealthAI. Thank you so much in these unusual times for joining this session. I think most of you are joining it via remote video link, and hopefully you'll be able to be part of the Q&A session that we have as a live broadcast as part of eyeforpharma Virtual Barcelona. So oncology today is one of the most rapidly growing therapeutic areas in the industry, and it's actually changing dramatically over the course of the last 2 years, and certainly as we look forward over the course of the next 5 years. About 60% of the research and development pipeline of biopharma is actually focused in oncology, and increasingly clinical studies and clinical trials are focused on much smaller patient populations. These are getting into ever rarer submutations of either patient populations that can be super durable responders, historically may have been non-responders to different therapeutic approaches, but all the same, clinical studies in the early phases can have as few as 250 patients associated with them. So super, super precise. Also, we're in a field where regulators may in fact be the stronger innovators and are challenging industry to actually become value innovators themselves and challenge their own legacy models about how they operate. So this encouragement actually has been super, super important. So aside from actually encouraging that the study outcomes have more relevance to community practitioners, which at the one time seems like it should make sense, but had not been the way actually things have been conducted in the past, it's actually using real world data to start informing the design and potentially being a part of the submission to the FDA. These oftentimes get called external control arms, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as I go through the rest of my comments here. Finally, FDA itself has been actually gaining greater confidence on AI, machine learning, and data science-based approaches more broadly. Some of this is actually in software as a medical device approvals that started coming through in 2016, 17, and 18 that were based on retrospective real world data with an AI model, oftentimes applied to diagnostic modalities, but now also increasingly be used for safety analysis and an array of other analyses, sometimes informing what the relevant population or focus of a clinical study actually may be. So we'd like to actually assert here that real world data enabled insights can have the same or comparable utility to RCT studies by using clinical rules that have been submitted to peer review in highly specialized natural language processing and AI-based approaches. Here's an illustration from some of our work. Oftentimes, historically, in real-world data analyses, we would have used proxy measures. So one of those proxy measures for survival would have been treatment discontinuation. A second proxy measure would have been to time to next treatment as a proxy. As you can see from this analysis, analyzing the same data set, you can actually see a difference between a median of 7.6 months in one proxy and 9.2. However, if we do direct clinical inspection using clinical teams with very defined set of business rules as to where they go in unstructured data, they actually define that the actual median is 12.2 months of progression-free survival. That's an enormous difference. Would either make the difference between whether a physician might choose to treat with a particular therapeutic entity for that particular patient, or whether something would be considered approvable or non-approvable going forward. Second part is we now can see that most data is structured data, and fill rates of certain structured data, because of how EMRs are used in a practical setting, can be low to actually not being present in the record. But now we can see that with natural language processing applied to very specific terminology sets in some of the same categories, complementing the structured data fill rates, we can begin to move towards mid to high 90s, reflecting that, which actually means I get more utility out of the same data by combining some of these data sets, and the NLP tools have the same veracity as a human curator reading the file in the record. Same thing is true when we look at next generation sequencing data that may be contained in an appended PDF or otherwise. Now we're actually seeing natural language processing tools being trained on very specific subsets of data, given a context of what they're reading in the file in a very short period of time, can receive a very high rate of precision overall. So Now we're beginning to think of AI and machine learning as optics on data. They can provide insights that extend beyond where medical literature may have taken us at one particular point in time, with the benefit actually accruing over kind of multiple years. So instead of waiting for an observation to appear in the published literature, we actually can get that observation from applying unsupervised and semi-supervised learning tools. And an example from some of the tools that Concerto HealthAI is doing in combination with its colleagues at Symphony AI, we can actually identify patient cohorts that actually have significant differences in 60-day progression rates, where some have a higher rate of progression, some have a substantially lower rate of progression. In non-small cell, looking at second line, we can actually find early progressors and non-early progressors. And from this, we can start to actually discern specific characteristics of those subcohort populations that actually allow them to be predetermined. And then around that, we can identify either insights to leverage to allow others to be beneficiaries, or actually synergistic combinations or alternative protocols for these populations that may improve their respective outcomes. Next part is we can actually identify characteristics of underlying subpopulations. Back to the unsupervised learning example, I now can actually identify characteristics of patients who actually may be alive or not survive through the entire study design period. I can use this to start informing characteristics of the inclusion-exclusion criteria that assures that the intent of the study itself can be realized in the time frame targeted so that as many patients as possible can be benefited. Again, these tools are developing amazing levels of accuracy that are contributing to the performance of these studies overall. In one example that we were actually allowed to share publicly, we now can actually take data that is prepared through the processing of the 95% of data that is in fact unstructured, making it available for machine reading, done in the context with analytic tools, including AI tools. We now can actually execute a study design that is robust and actually around which we have higher confidence of feasibility in less than half the time that it would have taken using legacy tools. Feasibility and ad hoc analyses can be done in as little as 1/10 of the time using some of these same basic approaches. Next is real-world data are actually increasingly used and increasingly viable as part of regulatory submissions. And where this is true, it has a time benefit, often between 1 and 3 years, and has a significant resource benefit around doing that. Now, in many cases, this bears different names. FDA now refers to this as external control arms. It's actually also been called synthetic control arms. External control arm would refer to use of roughly contemporaneous retrospective electronic medical record derived plus claims, or could be potentially registry data submitted actually as part of the submission package accompanying the active treatment arm. So instead of accruing patients to actually the control arm or a standard of care arm, there's only an active treatment arm plus the external control. This is particularly useful where you have super rare populations that are actually where the response rate to the current standard of care may be very low to actually there is no available effective treatment for these patients at all. It is probably not actually the best approach for large population diseases where actually the controls themselves are actually going to be a substantial part of the validity of this, the statistics of this, and the confidence in broad-based chronic disease usage. But in areas like oncology and other acute diseases, this actually has very high utility. So when you take these particular themes, and again, I'll go back and say we've been discussing for a number of years the fact that real-world data, real-world evidence will begin to shift and change the nature about how clinical research is taking place. What we would say now is that independent third-party analysts, in this case Goldman Sachs, are now projecting that between 25 and 50% of all clinical trials will have RWE generation and utilization in support of those studies somewhere, with actually fully 50% of oncology studies actually having the same, the 40% of immuno-oncological studies, And as we kind of continue to go through other rare disease types, we'll continue to see that utility. I want to stand back a little bit from this because what we're talking about is a end-to-end wholesale change in some of how we think about the questions of interest, how we actually identify and design the study and the research that we're actually going to be doing, how we actually validate that study concept, how we plan for that concept, and the data elements that will actually go into the regulatory submission. So increasingly, we're trying to kind of think about this as actually being a end-to-end digital and evidence-based paradigm where actually we're using data from the community context and from the care provision context in the clinical study context, and actually then starting to deploy as much of that into those same settings. So when we put this all together, we think we've arrived, and we think really it was towards the latter end of 2019, going into 2020, that we've started arriving into what we now term the fourth generation of real world evidence. And for us, fourth generation of real world evidence has a set of very specific characteristics. So let me just go back in time and kind of amplify why we kind of have labeled these particular generations. So generation one was claims data. Claims data came easily, they were highly standardized, they actually were machine readable, and they actually provided some base level clinical and economic insights. In rare diseases and diseases like oncology, they actually had relatively limited utility. I can't really assess progression-free survival. There's certain clinical characteristics that aren't there. I cannot assess whether or not patients are treated according to guidelines. And so therefore, there became an increasing emphasis on actually EMR data. As the HITECH Act came into the United States, as standards HL7 were adopted internationally, and in fact, a lot of standards, whether it's Smart on Fire and other components, are being adopted internationally, you got a second generation. And this is now bringing in electronic medical record data. EMR data were first presented as structured only. And the deficiency on that is that a lot of the action, as it were, sits in the unstructured data. That's 95% of health data is in fact unstructured data. And so as we kind of approach that particular time, we actually find that actually we need to get access to that unstructured data to enable things to become research grade. The third generation of companies actually focused an emphasis on changing what was captured in the EMR, but also the abstraction of key concepts coming out of that data. But oftentimes just did this on a study specific and very bespoke basis. The fourth generation has actually said these data and the processing of these data at scale with high precision, actually now at research grade, these can now become part of how we make decisions at the enterprise level. The enterprise can be the life sciences company that can inform translational medical studies as I actually get longitudinal, deeply curated patient history connected into genomic history. It can be in clinical development. It can be informing the clinical study design. It can be informing where I run that study. It can be actually part of the submission package as the external control arm. And so this is in a live dynamic set of tools now actually accessible again at the enterprise level. Post-approval can involve studies that are actually done using retrospective data that actually can lead to label modification or that can optimize the outcomes for certain patient populations by doing subsequent research. In addition, now as these tools go down into clinical workflows, I have this ability to do prospective RWD and actually use these same tools to augment selection of treatment for patients and selection of clinical study for patients. So in fact, some of the same ways of thinking and working of the innovators can move into the actual provider community, and some of the same considerations of the provider community can start to inform the clinical study designs and the execution approaches of actually the biopharma innovators. Again, all this at the enterprise level, all using process data, structured and unstructured, integral AI, machine learning, and other components in a very high confidence, transparent way to drive outcomes of interest. How do we bring this all together into an integral model where actually the care providers and the innovators and their respective interests are actually able to be accommodated together, and ultimately having patients be the ultimate beneficiary of all this as we get to that 25% reduction in cancer deaths in 10 years. We believe it's possible. We're already beginning to see the promise 18 months into this, and we are redoubling our efforts and commitments to it. And thank you very much, and I look forward to talking to you during the Q&A period.